When you're a delivery driver, you get used to some weird stuff. People in bathrobes, awkward small talk, dogs that look like they want to eat you. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for that night. It was a Friday and I was working the dinner shift as usual. The app pinged with a big order, 3 large pizzas, sides, and a bunch of drinks, all from this fancy Italian place downtown. I'd been delivering for a while and I knew the big orders usually meant a good tip, so I was pretty pumped. The address was in one of those upscale neighborhoods just outside the city. You know, the kind with mansions and gates where everyone drives luxury cars and the lawns are always perfectly manicured. I grabbed the food, loaded up my car, and headed out. The sun was setting as I drove, and by the time I got close to the address, it was almost dark. The GPS led me through winding roads lined with towering trees and massive houses hidden behind tall fences. The place looked like something out of a movie, quiet, serene, and more than a little intimidating. I followed the GPS to the end of a long, secluded road and stopped in front of this enormous house. It was massive, like a castle, with stone walls and ivy creeping up the sides. There were no lights on, though, and no cars in the driveway. It looked empty, almost abandoned, but the address matched, so I figured they were just out, or maybe they liked living in the dark. Rich people, right? I got out, grabbed the bags of food, and walked up to the front door. I knocked a couple of times, but there was no answer. I waited, shifting from foot to foot, glancing around. The place was dead silent, not even the sound of crickets or anything. I knocked again, louder this time, and that's when I heard it, the door creaking open. It opened just a crack, enough for me to see the dark interior, and a voice came from inside, low and almost a whisper. "Leave it on the table in the foyer and close the door behind you." I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone through the crack, just darkness in that voice. It gave me the creeps. But then again, maybe they just didn't want to come to the door. Maybe they were sick or something, I don't know why, but I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The house was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your skin prickle. I looked around, squinting into the dim light. The foyer was huge, with marble floors and a chandelier hanging above. The table was right there, just a few steps in. I moved quickly, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and set the bags down on the table. Your food's here," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty space. "I'm just gonna leave it here and go." I turned to leave, feeling that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I almost ran to the door, my hand reaching for the knob, but before I could grab it, the door slammed shut with a bang that made me jump. "What the hell?" I muttered, my heart pounding. I yanked on the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was starting to freak out, my hands shaking as I pulled and twisted the knob, but it was like it was locked from the outside. I fumbled for my phone, realizing I'd left it in the car with the app still running. Great, just great. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I was trapped in some stranger's house, my phone was outside, and I had no way to get out. I had to find another way. There had to be another door, a back entrance, something. I turned around, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. There were stairs leading up to a second floor and a hallway that disappeared into shadows. My heart was racing, my skin crawling with that awful feeling that I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Anyone here?" No answer. Just silence, thick and heavy. I walked slowly down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The house was huge, filled with antique furniture and paintings that seemed to watch me as I passed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. Just empty rooms and more silence. I don't know why I kept going. Maybe I thought I'd find another exit, or maybe I just didn't want to stand there, waiting for something to happen. But the further I went, the more I regretted it. The house felt wrong, like I was walking through a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I turned a corner and saw a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I pushed it open, holding my breath, and found myself in what looked like an office. There was a desk, a bookshelf, and a few chairs, all covered in a thick layer of dust. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. Something that made my blood run cold. On the desk, spread out like some kind of sick display, were photographs. of me, taken that day while I was working. Shots of me picking up food, driving my car, even standing outside the house just before I'd gone inside. I felt like I was going to throw up. My hands were shaking as I reached out and picked one up, my mind racing. Who had taken these? Why? And then I saw the notebook. It was lying open on the desk, pages filled with writing in a messy scrawl. I flipped through it, my heart pounding. It was all about me, my name, my schedule, where I lived, even stuff about my family. Things no one should know. Things I hadn't told anyone. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. This was insane. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran out of the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. I found myself in the kitchen, a massive, empty space that smelled faintly of something rotten. I spotted a back door and ran to it, yanking on the handle. Locked. I felt like I was going to scream, my mind racing with panic. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing in the silence. I pressed myself against the door, my eyes darting around the room looking for something, anything I could use as a weapon. And then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I was shaking, my body tense and ready to bolt. And then, a voice. "Why are you leaving so soon?" It was the same voice from before, low and mocking. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I turned slowly, my eyes wide, but there was no one there. Just the empty kitchen and the dark hallway beyond. "I just want to go home," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please let me go." The laughter that followed was cold and hollow, echoing through the empty house. I felt a surge of panic, my hands shaking as I tried the door again, yanking on the handle with all my strength. It wouldn't budge. I ran through the house, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Every door I tried was locked, every window sealed shut. It was like the house was alive, trapping me inside, mocking my every move. I was breathing hard, tears streaming down my face, my throat raw from screaming for help. I stumbled back into the foyer, my vision blurry with fear and exhaustion. I fell against the door, pounding on it with my fists, begging for someone to hear me. The photographs, the notebook, the voice. It was all too much. I felt like I was going to break, my mind snapping under the weight of it all. I had to get out of there. I bolted down the hallway, not caring about being quiet anymore. I found a back door near the kitchen and yanked it open, stumbling out into the night air. I didn't stop to think, I just ran through the trees, down the road until I saw a light in the distance. It was a neighbor's house, the only sign of life in this God-forsaken place. I pounded on their door, breathless and shaking. An older woman answered, her face filled with concern as I spilled out everything that had happened. She called the police and I sat on her porch, my heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. When the cops showed up, I led them back to the house. But when we got there, it was empty. No food, no photos, no notebook, nothing. The door was unlocked, and the house looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The officers didn't seem to believe me, but they took a report anyway, chalking it up to some kind of prank. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the notebook, the photos, about how someone had been watching me. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that someone's still out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone back to that neighborhood, and I never will. Some deliveries just aren't worth the risk. I've always considered myself a pretty cautious guy. I've been doing food delivery for a while now, and you get a feel for people and places. You learn when something's off, you know? But that night, I guess I let my guard down, and I've regretted it ever since. It was a Friday night, and I was already pushing the end of my shift. I was looking forward to going home, maybe grabbing a late-night snack, and just zoning out. I'd already accepted that the last delivery I was on would be my final one. It was a simple drop-off at an apartment building I'd been to dozens of times before. No big deal. But then, right as I was about to hit go offline on the app, a new order popped up. It was a big one, a whole bunch of stuff from this fancy Italian restaurant across town. The payout was tempting, way more than I'd usually get for a single delivery. The address was an upscale high-rise in the city, and I thought, why not? It's just one more delivery. I headed to the restaurant, picked up the order, and punched the address into my GPS. The drive was smooth, traffic was light for a Friday night, and I made it to the building in no time. As I pulled up, I saw the doorman, a guy I'd seen a couple of times before. He usually nodded or waved when I arrived, but this time he didn't. He just stared at me as I walked in with the food. I shrugged it off and headed towards the elevators. As I stepped inside, I glanced at my phone to check the details. The app said the customer was on the 14th floor, apartment 1408. I hit the button and felt the elevator lurch as it started to rise. I remember thinking it was weird that there was no phone number attached to the order. Normally people include one, just in case, but not this time. I reached the 14th floor and stepped out into a long hallway. The building was quiet, almost too quiet. It was one of those places where every sound echoes and the air feels too still. I found apartment 1408 and knocked on the door. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, and I could hear movement inside. Someone shuffling around. I waited a few more seconds, and then the door opened just a crack. A man's face appeared, half hidden in the shadows. He had this look on his face like he was sizing me up. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I've got your order here." The guy nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to the bags in my hands. "Yeah, thanks. Just bring it in and set it on the counter." Now, I don't usually go into people's apartments. Most folks don't want you in their space, especially during a delivery. But the guy seemed insistent, and I was tired. I just wanted to drop the food and get out of there. So I stepped inside. The apartment was dimly lit, the only light coming from a couple of lamps in the living room. I glanced around as I walked in, taking in the sparsely furnished space. There was something off about it. It didn't look lived in, you know? No personal touches, no photos, nothing. I set the bags down on the counter and turned to leave, but the guy was blocking my path. He was taller than I realized, and his face was still partly hidden in the shadows. "Is there anything else?" I asked, feeling a slight edge of unease creeping in. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I need you to come with me." That's when I saw it, the gun in his hand pointed casually at his side. My heart skipped a beat and I took a step back, my eyes flicking to the door. "Listen, man, I just deliver food. I don't want any trouble." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're not in trouble. I just need you to come with me. It won't take long." Everything in me was screaming to run, to push past him and get the hell out of there, but I was frozen. He gestured with the gun, and I had no choice but to follow him down the hallway, my mind racing with all the things that could go wrong. He led me to the elevator and pushed the button for the basement. As the doors closed, I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. This was bad, really bad. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, and my mind was a blur of fear and confusion. What the hell did he want with me? The doors opened to a dimly lit corridor and he pushed me forward. I glanced back, hoping to see a security camera, anything that might help me later. But there was nothing, just blank walls and flickering lights. He stopped in front of a metal door and knocked twice. A second later it swung open, and another guy stepped out, this one even bigger, with a shaved head and a scowl that made my blood run cold. They exchanged a look and I felt my stomach drop. This was it. I was screwed. "Empty your pockets," the second guy said, his voice like gravel. I did as I was told, pulling out my phone, wallet, and keys, my hands trembling. He grabbed them and shoved them into his pocket, then nodded towards the room. "Get in." I stepped inside, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The room was small and windowless, with a single chair in the center. The walls were bare, and the air smelled stale, like it had been empty for a long time. "Sit," the first guy said, his gun still in his hand. I sat, my mind racing with ways to get out of this. But I was trapped. I had no phone, no way to call for help. I was at their mercy. For what felt like hours, they questioned me. They asked me who I was, how I got the order, what I knew. I answered everything, my voice shaking, trying to keep my head clear. But the more I talked, the more I realized they didn't really care about my answers. They just wanted to scare me, to keep me there for some reason I couldn't understand. Finally, the first guy stepped back, looking me over with that same calculating gaze. "We're done here," he said, turning to the other guy. "Get rid of him." My blood turned to ice. "Wait, please, I don't..." But before I could finish, the door flew open and a flood of light filled the room. I blinked, dazed, as two men in dark clothes rushed in, their voices sharp and commanding. "Get on the ground," one of them shouted, his gun pointed at the two guys who'd been holding me. They froze, their eyes wide with shock, and then dropped to their knees, their hands raised. It took me a second to realize what was happening. The men who'd burst in, undercover cops. They moved quickly, cuffing the two guys and pulling them out of the room. I sat there, stunned, as the reality of the situation sank in. One of the officers turned to me, his face serious but kind. "Are you okay?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He helped me up, his grip firm and steady. "You're lucky," he said, his voice low. "We've been tracking these guys for weeks. You walked into a sting operation." I felt a wave of relief and fear wash over me. I was safe, but only by chance. I could have been shot, killed, who knows what. The thought made me dizzy, and I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. They took my statement, asked me about the delivery, how I got there, everything. I answered as best I could, still shaken, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. They told me that the two guys had been using fake delivery orders to lure people into the building, that they were after something specific, but they wouldn't say what. They took my wallet as evidence at first, but realized I had nothing to do with this situation and was completely oblivious. I was thankful for that. There wouldn't be any reason to keep my stuff as evidence. I quit the job shortly after. I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been this close to something terrible. I still get nervous when I think about it, when I remember the look in that guy's eyes, the way he smiled like he had all the time in the world. It's been a few months now, and I've tried to move on, but some nights when I'm lying in bed, I think about that delivery, about what could have happened. I wonder how many other people have been caught in situations like that. How many weren't as lucky? I never thought something like this would happen to me. I mean, you hear stories all the time about delivery drivers getting into sketchy situations, but you never think it'll be you. I'd been doing food delivery for a few months, mostly to make some extra cash while I was in college. It was easy money and the flexibility was great. I could do my homework during the day and make deliveries at night. It was perfect, until that night. It was a typical Friday night, or so I thought. I was working the dinner shift, driving around, delivering pizzas and burgers to students and families in this small town just outside of Austin, Texas. It was the usual stuff, people too lazy to cook or go out, tipping just enough to keep me motivated. I was wrapping up my shift, thinking about calling it a night when a new order popped up on the app. It was from this small hole-in-the-wall restaurant I'd never heard of, tucked away on the outskirts of town. The order was for a single meal, and the delivery address was in a rural area I wasn't familiar with. I hesitated for a second, but the payout was decent, and I figured it'd be a quick drop-off. Just get it done and head home, no big deal. I picked up the order, some fried chicken and sides, and plugged the address into my GPS. It took me down a winding, narrow road that seemed to get darker and more isolated the further I drove. My headlights were the only thing lighting up the path, and the trees on either side loomed over like they were closing in on me. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. It was just a delivery, nothing to worry about. After what felt like forever, I finally pulled up to the address. The place looked abandoned. The house was old and overgrown with vines, barely visible in the darkness. There were no lights on, no cars in the driveway, nothing, just silence. I double-checked the app to make sure I was at the right place, and sure enough, it matched. I shot the customer a message saying I was outside. Almost immediately I got a response. "Yeah, that's the place, just leave the food on the porch." There was something off about the way they phrased it, but I brushed it off as my nerves acting up. I got out of the car, leaving the engine running, and started walking towards the porch. That's when I heard it, a voice low and gravelly coming from the shadows near the house. "Hey, over here." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned towards the voice, squinting into the darkness. I couldn't see anyone, just the faint outline of the house and the dense trees behind it. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. There was no response, just silence. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to get out of there. As I turned to head back to my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My tires had been slashed. All 4 of them, completely flat. I couldn't believe it. I felt a surge of panic, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone to call for help. But before I could dial, I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden behind masks. There were 4, maybe 5 of them, all dressed in dark clothes, moving towards me with a calmness that made my stomach churn. My first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. The road was deserted, and the house was surrounded by woods. I backed up against the car, my mind racing, trying to think of what to do. One of them stepped forward, a tall guy with a baseball bat slung over his shoulder. "Hand over everything," he said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Wallet, phone, keys, now." I could barely breathe. My mouth was dry, and I felt like my legs were going to give out. I knew I didn't have a choice. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet and phone, tossing them onto the ground in front of me. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers shaking, and threw them down too. The guy with the bat stepped closer, his eyes cold and unblinking behind the mask. "Get out of the car," he said. I hesitated for a second, but then I felt a sharp pain in my side as one of the others shoved me, knocking the wind out of me. I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground, and that's when they pounced. They dragged me out of the car, throwing me onto the gravel. I tried to fight back, but they were too many, their hands grabbing and pulling, hitting and kicking. It felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. They beat me until I was curled up on the ground, my body aching, my face pressed against the cold dirt. I could hear them laughing, talking to each other, their voices distant and hollow in my ears. "Stupid delivery guy," one of them sneered, "thought he could get away." I wanted to scream, to yell at them, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe. I heard the sound of footsteps as they walked away, the crunch of gravel fading into the distance. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, my body shaking, my mind numb with fear and pain. When I finally found the strength to move, I managed to push myself up, my head spinning. I looked around, but there was no sign of them. They were gone, and so was my car. I stumbled to my feet, every part of me hurting, and started walking, trying to get as far away from that place as possible. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I saw lights in the distance. A house, small and modest, with a single light on in the front. I dragged myself to the door, my hands shaking as I knocked, my vision blurring. A middle-aged woman answered, her eyes widening in shock as she saw me. "Please," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper, "I need help." She let me in, her hands gentle as she guided me to the couch. She called the police, her voice calm and steady, even as she looked at me with concern and fear. I remember feeling so grateful, so relieved to be somewhere safe, but the pain and exhaustion were too much. I blacked out before the cops arrived. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, my body covered in bruises, my face swollen and sore. The police were there, asking me questions, but I could barely focus. I told them everything I could remember about the order, the house, the masks. They listened, nodding, but their faces were grim. They told me later that the account used to place the order was stolen. The credit card linked to it reported missing weeks ago. The address didn't exist on any map, and when they searched the area, they found no sign of the house or the attackers. It was like they had just disappeared. I don't know who they were or why they targeted me. Maybe they'd done it before. Maybe they'd do it again. The police said they'd investigate, but I could tell they didn't hold out much hope. People like that, they know how to cover their tracks. I took a few weeks off after that, too scared to get back on the road. Every time I thought about making a delivery, I felt my heart race, my hands start to shake. I couldn't do it. I kept seeing their faces in my mind, the coldness in their eyes, the way they laughed as they beat me. But life goes on, right? Bills need to be paid, and I couldn't just sit around forever. I went back to delivering, but things were different. I was different. I only took daytime shifts, only delivered to familiar places. I kept my head down, avoided eye contact, never took any risks. And every time I passed a dark, empty road, I felt that fear again. That cold, gnawing fear that made my skin crawl and my heart pound. I knew they were out there, somewhere, waiting, watching. I haven't gone back to that town since, haven't driven down that road. I don't think I ever will. Some things you just can't shake no matter how hard you try. Some memories stay with you, haunt you, remind you of just how fragile everything is. I don't know if they'll ever catch them. I don't know if they'll even try. But I do know this. No delivery, no tip, no extra cash is worth your life. Trust your instincts. Listen to that little voice that tells you something's wrong. Because sometimes it's the only thing standing between you and something you'll never be able to forget. And if you ever find yourself on a dark, deserted road, heading towards an unfamiliar address, remember my story. Remember what happened to me. Turn around and get out while you still can. You'd think after doing this delivery gig for a while you'd get a sense of what's normal and what's not. But I guess sometimes you just get unlucky. That night was one of those times. It was a Thursday around 8 p.m., and I was about ready to call it a night. I'd been delivering food all evening and was looking forward to getting home, maybe cracking open a beer, and just zoning out in front of the TV. But then this huge order popped up on the app from this high-end sushi place downtown. The payout was insane, and the delivery address was just a few miles away in a nice suburban neighborhood. I figured, what the hell, one last run before heading home, right? I picked up the order, must have been at least $100 worth of food, and headed out. The neighborhood was one of those quiet, well-kept places where every lawn is perfectly manicured and every house looks like it came out of a catalog. You know the type, it's nice but a little too perfect. Anyway, I found the house at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was big, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a car in the driveway. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. The front door was slightly open. Now, I've seen plenty of weird stuff doing this job, but an open door in a quiet neighborhood like this? That was new. I sat in my car for a second, staring at the house. My gut told me something was off, but the app said I was at the right place. I sent a quick text through the app, letting the customer know I was there. Almost immediately, I got a response. "Thanks, could you please bring it inside and set it on the kitchen counter?" I hesitated. Most people don't want you going inside their house, especially not in the middle of a pandemic. But maybe it was a big family gathering or something. I grabbed the bags and headed for the door, thinking I'd just set the food down and get out of there. "Hello?" I called out as I stepped into the entryway. It was dim inside, the kind of dim that makes you feel like you're walking into a place you shouldn't be. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. To my left, I saw the kitchen, a big open space with stainless steel appliances and granite countertops. It was nice, really nice. I put the bags down on the counter and turned to leave, but then I heard it, a soft, desperate voice from deeper inside the house. "Please don't leave." I froze. It was a woman's voice, trembling and scared. I turned back, my heart pounding. A woman stepped out from behind the kitchen island. She was in her mid-30s with long dark hair and this haunted look in her eyes. I could see the fear written all over her face, like she was about to burst into tears. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you need help?" She glanced over her shoulder, back towards the living room, and took a step closer to me. "You need to leave now," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Go to your car and call the police. Tell them to come quickly." My stomach dropped. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. "He's here," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "He has a gun. Please, just go." My brain was screaming at me to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. I glanced towards the living room, trying to see what she was talking about. That's when I saw him. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing in the shadows at the bottom of the stairs. He hadn't noticed me yet, but I could see the glint of metal in his hand. A gun. I didn't think. I just turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the woman's voice behind me pleading with him, trying to keep him from following. I didn't look back. I just ran, throwing myself into my car and locking the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. When the dispatcher answered, I could barely get the words out. "There's a woman," I stammered, my voice shaking. "She's being held hostage. There's a guy with a gun. You need to get here now." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, asking for the address, details, anything that could help. I gave them everything I knew, my eyes glued to the house, half expecting to see the guy burst out of the door, gun blazing. But nothing happened. The house was silent, the front door still ajar, just like I'd left it. I don't know how long I sat there waiting. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before I heard the sirens. I'd never been so relieved in my life. I saw the flashing lights of the police cars as they turned onto the street, a sense of hope swelling in my chest. 2 squad cars pulled up and the officers jumped out, their guns drawn. I got out of my car, waving frantically, trying to point them towards the house. They motioned for me to stay back, their faces grim as they approached the front door. I watched, my heart in my throat, as they moved in. One officer kicked the door open wider, and they disappeared inside. For a moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. And then chaos. I heard shouting, a crash, and then a gunshot. My heart stopped. I could barely breathe, my eyes fixed on the house. And then, a few seconds later, 2 officers came out, dragging the man between them. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his face twisted in anger. I saw the gun lying on the ground, kicked away by one of the officers. And then there she was, the woman stepping out of the house, tears streaming down her face. She looked around, her eyes scanning the street until they landed on me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and then she mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." I felt my knees go weak, relief washing over me in a wave. I'd done something good. I'd helped her. I wasn't just a scared delivery driver. I was the reason she was safe. The officers took my statement, asking me about what I'd seen and heard. I told them everything, my voice still shaking. They nodded, their faces serious, but there was a hint of a smile on one of the officers' faces as he thanked me for calling them. I sat in my car for a long time after that, watching as they loaded the guy into the back of a squad car and drove away. The woman was talking to one of the officers, her face pale but calm. She looked over at me once, gave me a small, tired smile, and then she was gone, driven away by another cop. I don't know what happened between them, whether it was a robbery gone wrong or something more personal. All I know is that I was in the right place at the right time and I made the right call. That woman could have died if I hadn't been there, if I hadn't listened to her. I didn't finish my shift that night. I drove home, my hands still trembling, my mind racing. I kept thinking about what could have happened, what almost did happen. I've been back to that neighborhood a few times since then, but I've never seen that woman again. I hope she's okay. I hope she got the help she needed. I still deliver food, but I'm more careful now. I listen to my gut, and if something doesn't feel right, I get out of there. No delivery, no tip, no amount of money is worth risking your life. That night taught me that sometimes you don't get a second chance. So if you're ever out there doing this kind of work, and you feel that nagging sense of something being off, trust it. Call for help. Get out, because you never know what kind of situation you might be walking into.